4. The doctoral dissertation. When Bruno Bauer urged Marx just to polish off his trivial examination, he had some grounds for impatience, for it was the autumn of 1839 and Marx had already been studying for 8 terms. Bauer certainly did not suppose that Marx was suffering from any examination fever in the usual and disagreeable sense of the term, or he would never have credited him with being able to bowl over the professors of philosophy in Bonn at the first encounter. It was characteristic of Marx, and it remained so until the end of his days, that his insatiable urge for knowledge permitted him to master difficult problems quickly, whilst his merciless self-criticism prevented him from having done with them equally quickly. In accordance with his usual thoroughness, Marx must have plunged into the greyest depths of Greek philosophy, and the representation of only the 3 systems of the philosophy of self-consciousness was no matter which could be settled in a few terms. Bauer, who turned out his own work at a great speed, much too quickly in fact for their permanence, had little understanding for this, much less than Friedrich Engels showed later on. Even Engels sometimes became impatient when Marx could find no limit and no end to his self-criticism. However, the trivial examination presented other difficulties, if not for Bauer then for Marx. Whilst his father was still alive, Marx had decided on an academic career without thereby abandoning completely the choice of a practical profession. But with the death of Altenstein, the most attractive feature of a professional career, and one which might have made up for its numerous disadvantages, began to disappear, namely, the comparative freedom granted to philosophers in their university chairs. Bauer himself was never tired of pointing out that the academic gown was good for nothing else, and in fact it was not long before Bauer discovered that even the scientific investigations of a Prussian professor could not be conducted entirely without let or hindrance. After Altenstein's death in May, 1840, the Ministry of Culture was taken over for a few months by Privy Councillor Ladenburg, who showed sufficient piety towards the memory of his old superior to make him want to fulfill the latter's promise to provide Bauer with a permanent appointment in Bonn. However, immediately Eichhorn was appointed Minister of Culture, the theological faculty in Bonn rejected the appointment of Bauer as professor on the ground that it would disturb the harmony of the faculty. Under Eichhorn it had succeeded in summoning up that rare heroism which German professors display when they are sure of the secret approval of their superiors. Bauer had spent his autumn holidays in Berlin and was on the point of returning to Bonn when the news reached him. A discussion immediately took place in the circle of his friends as to whether or not an irreparable breach had already occurred between the religious and the scientific schools, and whether a supporter of the latter could reconcile membership in a theological faculty with his scientific conscience. Bauer himself maintained his optimistic attitude towards the Prussian state and rejected a semi-official proposal made to him that he should occupy himself with literary work and receive a grant from the state funds the while. He returned to Bonn full of fighting spirit and in the hope that together with Marx, who was soon to follow him, he would be able to bring the crisis to a head. Neither of them abandoned the idea of issuing a radical journal together, but Marx's prospects of an academic career at the Rhenish University now appeared decidedly poor. As the friend and assistant of Bauer, he had to reckon with a hostile reception at the hands of the professorial clique in Bonn, and nothing was farther from his thoughts than to curry favor with Eichhorn or Ladenburg, as Bauer advised him to do in the justifiable hope that then everything in Bonn would be all right. In such matters Marx's ideas were always very strict, but even had he felt inclined to trust himself on such a slippery path, it was easy to foresee that sooner or later he must lose his balance, for Eichhorn was not long in showing his true colors. In order to finish off the decrepit mob of fossilized Hegelians at the University of Berlin once and for all, he appointed a professor named Schelling, a man who had come round in his old age to a belief in revelation, to discipline the students of Halle University, who had drawn up a respectful petition to the king as their rector asking him to appoint Strauss to a professorship in Halle. With such prospects, Marx as a young Hegelian decided not to take his examination in Prussia at all. He had no desire to give the zealous satellites of Eichhorn a chance of plaguing him, though he had no intention of evading the struggle. Quite to the contrary, in fact, he decided to take his doctor's degree at one of the smaller universities and then to publish his doctoral dissertation together with a challenging foreword as a proof of his knowledge and capacity. And after that to settle down in Bonn and publish the proposed magazine with Bauer. In this way Bonn University would not be completely closed to him because, as doctor promotus of a foreign university, he would have only 1 or 2 formalities to comply with in order to be given the freedom of the university as an independent lecturer. This was the plan that Marx actually carried out. On the 15th of April he was awarded the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in his absence by the University of Jena on the basis of a written dissertation dealing with the differences between Democritean and Epicurean natural philosophy. This dissertation was an anticipatory part of a larger work in which Marx intended to deal with the whole cycle of the Epicurean, Stoic and skeptic philosophy in its relation to Greek speculative philosophy as a whole. For the moment he demonstrated this relation on the basis of one example only and in connection with only the older speculative philosophy. Amongst the older natural philosophers of Greece, Democritus was the one who had adhered most closely to materialism. Out of nothing nothing can come, nothing that is can be destroyed. All change is nothing but the joining and separation of parts. Nothing happens fortuitously and everything that happens happens with reason and necessity. Nothing exists but the atoms and empty space, everything else is opinion. The atoms are endless in number and of an infinite variety in form, falling eternally through infinite space. The larger atoms, which fall more quickly, collide with the smaller atoms, and the material movements and rotations which result are the beginning of the formation of worlds. Innumerable worlds form and pass away coexistently and successively. Epicurus took over this conception of nature from Democritus, but he made certain alterations. The most famous of these alterations consisted in the so-called declination of the atoms. Epicurus contended that in their fall the atoms declined, that is to say, that they did not fall vertically, but in a deviation from the straight line. From Cicero and Plutarch to Leibniz and Kant, Epicurus has been thoroughly ridiculed for propounding this physical impossibility, and he has been dubbed an imitator of Democritus who merely botched the model which he took from his master. However, parallel with this condemnation of its physical absurdity, there is a tendency which regards the Epicurean philosophy as the most highly developed materialist system in the classic world, thanks largely to the fact that it has been perpetuated in the didactic poems of Lucretius, whereas only insignificant remnants of the philosophy of Democritus have weathered the storm and stress of the centuries. Kant dismissed the declination of the atoms as an insolent invention. Nevertheless he recognized Epicurus as the most noble philosopher of sensualism as against Plato, the most noble philosopher of the intellect. Naturally, Marx did not deny the physical unreasonableness of the Epicurean philosophy, and he condemned the reckless irresponsibility of Epicurus in the explanation of physical phenomena. But he pointed out that the only test of truth for Epicurus was the evidence of his senses. Epicurus believed the diameter of the sun to be 2 feet because it looked so to his eyes. However, Marx did not content himself with dismissing these evident absurdities with a phrase or two, but set himself to track down the philosophic reason in the physical unreason. He acted in accordance with the fine words he had used in honor of his master Hegel in a note to his dissertation. He pointed out here that when a master had committed a sin of accommodation, his philosophic school should not blame him, but seek to explain the accommodation from the inadequacy of the principle in which it must have its root, thus turning into an advance in knowledge what must appear an advance of conscience. That which was an end in itself for Democritus was nothing but a means to an end for Epicurus. Epicurus did not aim at an understanding of nature, but at a view of nature which would support his philosophic system. The philosophy of self-consciousness as it was known to the classic world fell into 3 schools, and according to Hegel the Epicureans represented the abstract individual consciousness of self, and the Stoics, the abstract general consciousness of self, both as one-sided dogmas opposed immediately on account of their one-sidedness by the skeptics, or as a later historian of Greek philosophy expressed the same relation. In Stoicism and Epicureanism the individual and the general aspects of the subjective spirit, the atomistic isolation of the individual and his pantheistic surrender to the whole, faced each other irreconcilably with the same claims, whilst this antagonism was neutralized in skepticism. Despite their common aims, the Epicureans and the Stoics were led far away from each other by their different starting points. Their surrender to the whole made the Stoics philosophically into determinists for whom the necessity of every happening was axiomatic, and politically into decided republicans, whilst on the religious field they were unable to free themselves from a superstitious and fettered mysticism. They looked for support to Heraclitus, in whom the surrender to the whole had taken on the form of the most uncompromising self-consciousness, though they treated him with as little ceremony as the Epicureans treated Democritus. On the other hand, the principle of isolated individuality made the Epicureans philosophically into indeterminists, into proclaimers of the free will of each individual. and politically into passive sufferers. The biblical exhortation, "Submit to the authorities which have power over you," is a heritage of Epicurus. At the same time this attitude freed them from all religious bonds. Marx then shows in a series of keen investigations how the difference between Democritean and Epicurean natural philosophy can be explained. Democritus concerned himself exclusively with the material existence of the atom, whereas Epicurus concerned himself further with the atom as a conception, with its form as well as its matter, with its essence as well as its existence. Epicurus regarded the atom as being not only the material basis of the world of phenomena, but also the symbol of the isolated individual, the formal principle of abstract individual self-consciousness. From the vertical fall of the atoms Democritus concluded the necessity of all happenings, whilst Epicurus caused his atoms to deviate from the straight line in their fall. For otherwise where, as Lucretius, the best-known interpreter of Epicurean philosophy, asks in his didactic poems, would be free will, the will of the living human being, wrested from the inexorable course of fate. This contradiction between the atom as a phenomenon and the atom as a conception is evident throughout the whole of the Epicurean philosophy and compels it to adopt that utterly arbitrary explanation of physical phenomena which was subjected to such ridicule even in the classic world. The contradictions of Epicurean natural philosophy are reconciled only in the movements of the heavenly bodies, whose general and eternal existence, however, destroys the principle of abstract individual self-consciousness. Epicurean natural philosophy thus abandons all material mummery, and Epicurus fights as the greatest Greek enlightener, as Marx calls him, against the tyranny of religion intimidating man with a baleful glance from the heights of heaven. In this his first work Marx reveals himself as a constructive thinker even if one questions the details of his interpretation of the Epicurean philosophy. In fact his independent thought becomes even more clear then, because the only possible objection can be that Marx developed the basic principle of Epicureanism further and drew clearer conclusions from it than Epicurus did himself. Hegel declared that the Epicurean philosophy was thoughtlessness on principle, and it is certainly true that its originator who, as a self-taught man, attached great importance to the language of the common people, did not clothe his thoughts in the speculative phraseology of Hegelian philosophy with which Marx explained it. With this dissertation the pupil of Hegel draws up his own certificate of maturity. He uses the dialectical method in a masterly fashion, and his style shows that vigor of expression which always characterized the language of his teacher Hegel, but which was so sadly lacking in the ranks of his camp followers. However, in this work Marx is still completely on the idealist basis of the Hegelian philosophy, and the most surprising thing about it for the present-day reader is the unfavorable verdict passed on Democritus. Marx declares that all Democritus did was to put forward a hypothesis which represented the result of experience and not its energizing principle, and that therefore this hypothesis was never fulfilled and never materially influenced the practical investigation of natural phenomena. On the other hand he praises Epicurus as the founder of the science of atomism, despite his arbitrariness in the explanation of physical phenomena and despite the abstract individual self-consciousness he preaches. This last, Marx admits, neutralizes all real and authentic science because it is not the individual unit which prevails in the nature of things. Today the matter is no longer open for discussion, as far as there is any science of atomism, and as far as the theory of tiny units of matter and the development of all phenomena as a result of their movement has become the basis of the modern investigations into natural phenomena. Explaining the laws of sound, light and heat and the chemical and physical alterations in material bodies, Democritus was the pioneer and not Epicurus. However, for the Marx of that period philosophy, or to be more accurate, abstract philosophy, was so completely science that he came to conclusion which we should hardly be able to understand today but for the fact that the very essence of his character was revealed in it. As far as Marx was concerned, living always meant working, and working fighting. What turned him against Democritus therefore was the lack of an energizing principle, or, as he put it later on, the chief weakness of all previous materialism. The appreciation of the thing, of reality, of sensualism only in the form of the object or the idea, and not subjectively, not in practice, not in human sensuous activity. And on the other hand, what drew him to Epicurus was the energizing principle which permitted this philosopher to revolt against and defy the crushing weight of religion. Weder von Blitzen geschicht, noch durch das Geraun von Guttern, oder des Himmels Murrend und Groll. The foreword which Marx intended to publish together with the dissertation and which he dedicated to his father-in-law breathes an unquenchable and fierce fighting spirit. As long as one drop of blood still pulses through the world-conquering and untrammeled heart of philosophy, it will always defy its enemies with the words of Epicurus. Not he is godless who scorns the gods of the multitude, but he who accepts the opinions of the multitude concerning the gods. Philosophy does not reject the avowal of Prometheus. Mich lictum wert, den gutern allen hegig hash. And to those who complain of their apparently deteriorated well-being it replies as Prometheus replied to Hermes, the servant of the gods. Für deinen Frondienst gab ich mein unzählig Los, das sei versichert, nimmermehr zum Tausch dar. Prometheus is the noblest saint and martyr in the philosophic calendar. This was the closing passage of Marx's defiant foreword which alarmed even his friend Bauer. But what seemed to the latter to be unnecessary temerity was in fact no more than the simple avowal of a man who was destined to be a second Prometheus, both in struggle and in suffering.